So I'm just going to run through a short presentation to highlight the key points from the latest report, and also to focus a little bit on the compliance situation. And this will be followed then by Paul, who will do a presentation that really focuses in on the sectoral drivers and what's actually causing the emission increases we're seeing. So just to say, first of all, this is a report being produced by the Emissions Statistics team in the EPA, and this is one part of the EPA's role in climate science. So we have a very broad remit covering the emissions trading, research, support for the Climate Council and the climate dialogue, and many other aspects of our work also very much focused on the climate area. And just to additionally add, it's not a report that is done in isolation by the EPA with EPA data. This is something that really builds on all the data sources across the system. So we take input in from many different sources, whether it's other departments and agencies or directly from companies. So this is it's a huge task, and it is something that is being produced now, as Sharon pointed out, on an earlier basis to really try and facilitate the stakeholders who really need this information to determine what the actions they need to take. So in the EPA strategic plan from 2022 to 2026, there's a key strategic goal there to update, to provide more timely and targeted data to support national ambitions on climate. And this is one step towards that, meeting that goal, which is to really bring this back to the earliest possible time, where we are happy that we can still provide numbers that are as close as possible to the final outputs. There are some differences in the availability of data for this July publication compared to what would be available if we published in October. One of those things is the energy balance, which is supplied by the SCI. So the final energy balance isn't published until September, but we have worked with the SCI with their interim energy balance and with some additional updates from them to get something that is really close to where that final balance will be. So there may still be some revisions if we talk about splits between different sectors that may get updated, but we're not anticipating any major change to the overall emissions levels. Similarly, there are some other data sources, such as relation to animal movements and related to waste and F gases, that will provide a richer data later in the year, but still at the overall level, we're happy that what we have is very indicative of where the emissions are. Ultimately, we will be submitting numbers. This is the normal cycle. We will be submitting numbers to the EU and UN next March and April for 2022. So 2021, sorry. So that is the final. That's when the numbers are finalised. So this is really significantly ahead both of our own previous provisional deadlines and also ahead of when we have to submit to the EU and UN. And just to point out, these are the two reports. So this report coming out now in July, we are conscious that the projections report, which we published in June, is quite close to this. So we are also looking to move that back a little bit in the future as well, which will also aid policymakers. In terms of the highlights from this report, the total emissions have increased by 4.7% in 2021 compared to the 2020 level, and that's 1.1% above the pre-COVID level in 2019. And we have seen increase across agriculture, transport, and energy, which are the three big sectors, but as well as the other increases and decreases elsewhere. One of the key points that we've seen is that there's been a tripling of coal and oil use in 2021 versus 2020, and that's meant more emissions from electricity generation. Compounded by the fact that there was also less wind in the year. It was a less windy year. In terms of the transport emissions, we did see something of a rebound from the lifting of COVID restrictions, although it is still below the pre-pandemic level. And then with agriculture, we saw emissions increase in 2021, and agriculture emissions hadn't really decreased. They weren't particularly impacted by the COVID restrictions, and there was an increase also in 2020. So this really follows on from that. Just to really then give you the numbers a little bit more hard data. So we can see energy industry's emissions, which is largely electricity generation plus a couple of other things, smaller things like fuel refining. They showed an increase of 17.6%. That's a 1.5 million tonne increase, so a very substantial increase in that sector. And again, that's the coal and oil use that is driving that in conjunction with the less electricity, less renewables. On the transport side, the increase is 6.1% in 2021, bringing it up to 10.9 million tonnes, but that is still actually 10.5% below the level we saw in 2019. And it is driven by petrol and diesel use in road transport, which would indicate, given both are increasing, that it's a largely return in terms of passenger transport. And when we get the final data later in the year, we'll be able to be more granular on that aspect. In terms of the residential sector, we are looking at a decrease here of 4.9%, 0.36 million tonnes, and this is really to be expected because we saw an increase in 2020 with more people working from home. So this is the reverse of that. But there are also other factors here, such as it was a warmer winter, so there was less requirement for heat, and it was also there was also a fuel price issue later towards the end of the year, which we're still seeing obviously now in 2022 with the price of oil and gas both very high. Finally, on the agriculture side, the increase of about 3% there, which is 0.67 million tonnes, and that is driven by the increased nitrogen fertilizer use, limestone application, and the increasing in dairy production. So just looking at what that looks like overall in terms of the absolute amount. So it's this 4.7% increase translates to 2.8 million tonnes of an increase in 2021. And that's actually a very substantial increase year to year. That is the highest increase we've seen across the time series. This goes back to 2012, but that's actually the highest the whole way back to 1990 for 1 year. Now, obviously, part of that is the rebound from COVID, which we saw, as I say, in the transport sector particularly. But there are those other factors, like in agriculture and energy, are not directly related to rebounding from the pandemic restrictions. So this it's to be clear, this is a worrying point in relation to our targets, which we'll get into later. In terms of the profile of our emissions, the three big sectors, as I highlighted, are agriculture, transport, and energy industries in that order. And the relative share of those hasn't changed in the last year particularly, and actually has been, as you can see on the little graph on the left there, relatively consistent across the time series. The total emissions in the year are 61.5 million tonnes, and as Sharon pointed out, we have moved to the what are called AR5 global warming potentials, which basically means the conversion factor we use to convert other gases to a CO2 equivalent have changed from what was in the previous IPCC, the fourth assessment report. And this is as a result of updated science and you know, the impact of higher concentrations of some of these gases in the atmosphere. So that is something that has meant a higher overall level across the whole time series. So we've revised all the data back to 1990 to take account of that, and roughly in the region of 0.8 million tonnes of that 61.5 million tonne total is caused by the increase by the move from one to the other, which primarily affects methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions, with the factor for methane going up and the factor for nitrous oxide going down. But also in the F-gas sector, there's quite a lot of gases in there whose global warming potential has changed with this revision. In terms of our Climate Act target and carbon budgets, as Sharon pointed out, we have new targets now, and under the Climate Act we have a 51% reduction target for 2030 compared to 2018. And just to be clear, that includes land use change emissions, which I hadn't included in the total on the previous page, and I hadn't included in that split. It's not something that we generally, when we do comparisons across countries, include. But for the purpose of the Climate Act target, you'll see those numbers are higher, so they're nearly 70 million tonnes because they include LULUCF in it as well, and LULUCF is and I'll go into later, but it is an emitting sector in Ireland, not in all countries. So the target trajectory then to that 51% reduction obviously gets tougher because we've increased emissions in 2021, and actually what we anticipate or estimate based on where we are now is that we would need an average annual emissions reduction of about 7.5% from 2022 to 2030 to meet that 51% reduction target. And then similarly, that 51% reduction target was used to set a carbon budget, so actual physical total amount of CO2 equivalent allowed to be emitted over three budget periods. And the first budget period has a limit of 295 million tonnes and goes from 2021 to 2025. And what we're seeing here is that in 2021, we've used up 23.5% of that 5-yearly budget. So that's obviously almost a quarter in the first year. So that really does put pressure on the remaining 4 years. So in this situation, it would need an over 8% per annum emissions reduction, 2022 to 2025, to stay within that 295 million tonne budget. We also have EU targets, as Sharon mentioned there, and these these are the existing ones. So we're conscious there are new targets being debated and agreed at the moment, but the existing target for 2030 under the effort sharing regulation is combined of a 30% reduction in emissions by 2030 on the 2005 level. But it's also it's set in place using binding annual emission allocations, and the annual emission allocations are the red bars there, and on top of that we've shown a flexibility that is available to us in relation to, and that Ireland has indicated it will use to allow Ireland to move some emissions essentially from the emissions trading sector into the effort sharing regulation sector. So the scope of this, this target from the EU doesn't include the emissions trading scheme, and so that flexibility is around being able to move some of the pressure from the emissions trading scheme into the some of the leeway into the effort sharing regulation sectors. So it doesn't include, for example, power generation or large industry, but does include transport and agriculture, for example. What we're saying for 2021, the blue bar are the emissions from the 2021 inventory within scope, and we're saying that we're seeing an exceedance of 2.7 million tonnes compared to the annual emission allocation before any flexibilities are considered. With the use of that ETS flexibility we mentioned, which is worth 1.9 million tonnes per year, that would reduce to a 0.8 million tonne exceedance, but still an exceedance. There is a further flexibility available to Ireland in relation to LULUCF action, and if it's assessed on a 5-yearly basis, so it's not something that we can comment on in the first year. What that will require will be actions to reduce emissions or increase removals in the land sector, the LULUCF sector, and that could include measures such as re-wetting or water table management on agricultural land that's on organic soils, so farmer peaty soils, afforestation, and similar types of measures such as rehabilitation of bogland. So all those kinds of things can contribute towards using that flexibility. However, we are indicating in this report that, and we indicated previously in the projections report, that the current situation, current state of knowledge in relation to forestry on peaty soils, which is new research that came on board around this time last year, and was brought into the inventory in the 2020 inventory, which was submitted to the UN in April. That does mean that there is far less removals available from forestry than was originally thought, and actually forestry becomes an emitting source in the 2020s. So that does impact on the potential available flexibility to Ireland. So at the moment we're not assessing any flexibility as coming from the LULUCF flexibility here, and what we're indicating is that there's an exceedance and just referring to the emissions trading flexibility. So we can talk further about that, and there's some more detail in the report. But that's the situation in relation to the existing effort sharing regulation targets. I'll do a little bit of a run through the key sectors, but as I say, in terms of the key drivers, I'll leave that for Paul to go through the main event. So for agriculture, the increase of 3% is being driven by a combination of fertilizer use and an increase in animal numbers, and particularly dairy cows, because they're quite high emitting per animal. So this is and the fertilizer use is largely coincidental with the intensive agriculture sector as well. So the two things generally go together, and this is in line with the milk production increase we would have seen. There's also an increase in liming or limestone application, as it's called, and that has an impact on emissions, but it is also something that we would consider a positive measure in terms of soil fertility, and ultimately that will end up in reducing the requirement for nitrogen fertilizer. So it's a largely positive measure. Other things we've seen here are increases in other animal numbers. So we've seen sheep numbers increase by 0.3%, non-dairy cows increase by 0.3%, pigs increased by 4.5%. So there's lots of things that are up and across the board really in the agriculture sector. So it's been a positive year in terms of production, but that has unfortunately been tied to an increase in emissions. And I think that's the message here, is we haven't yet decoupled the two things in this sector. In the transport sector, as I pointed out at the start, we have a 6.1% increase in emissions, and And as you can see from the graph there, there was a big drop in 2020 because transport obviously was the most affected by COVID restrictions when people were tied up in their homes. So we've seen a rebound of 6.1%, but still, as I say, 10.5% below the 2019 level. So there's still an element of probably still an element of hybrid working involved. And there would have been some restrictions in the early 2021 still in terms of travel. Yes, of course, fuel pricing issues towards the end of the year may also have played a role, but we won't see that really until the 2022 inventory when we might see the pricing impacts more clearly. It's worth pointing out that this is the transport sector as defined for the inventory does not include international aviation. So it includes domestic aviation, which is a very small category, such as flights from Dublin to Shannon, for example, that kind of thing. But it does not include flights from Ireland to Europe or the US. They're reported in the inventory as a memo item, but not part of the total inventory numbers. And those numbers are very far down, and obviously those reductions are welcome from a climate perspective. So the international aviation emissions in a pre-COVID year would have been in the region of 3 million tonnes and are down around the 1.3 million tonnes in 2021. So there's a substantial reduction there, but that is something that international aviation is something that is tackled on a global basis rather than an individual country basis. So it's not reported as part of the individual countries' inventories. And road transport is 94.4% of those emissions in the graph here. Moving on to the energy industry sector, which, as I say, is, as you can see from the graph, is primarily public electricity and heat production, with electricity generation there, with some little elements coming from petroleum refining, briquetting, and other industries like that. And some fugitive emissions also, but we have seen a tripling of coal and oil use. Is a very big increase from what had been quite a low base. So we had seen in the years up to 2020 and in 2020 itself, coal use being very low, or have gone to historically low levels in terms of what was being used in Money Point. In 2021, as people may be aware, there were issues around generation plant availability due to outages or plant maintenance. And then obviously we had price impacts then towards the end of the year as well, where gas became very expensive, which may also have played a role. The other thing that happened in this sector in 2021 was that it wasn't a particularly windy year, so there was less wind available. There was 16% less wind generated compared to 2020, which is a substantial drop. And that does happen from year to year, and you can see some of the volatility in that time series is related to the fact that one year might be windier than another. There was also, and as the two things generally go hand in hand, a decrease in hydroelectricity as well in 2021 by 20%. So the emissions intensity, and Paul may talk more about the drivers here and what that means, would have been at a historic low level in 2020, but has gone back up again slightly up to above 300 grams per kilowatt hour again in 2021. So yes, overall emissions are still 9.4% below 1990 levels, and that is still a substantial reduction given the. Here's the emissions intensity. You can see that's continued to decline over the entire time series, when we would have used a lot more coal and peat back in the early 90s. And moved to more efficient gas plants and move away from coal and peat, and then the renewables coming upstream as well have all led to this kind of inexorable reduction in the emissions intensity of our electricity generation. With that blip now, as you can see in 2021, where the coal use has returned as a result of international and local factors. Moving on then to the residential sector, and we see this is one sector where we have seen a decrease in emissions. It's gone down by almost 5% in 2021, and that follows on an increase that we saw in 2020. So this, as I said, was an increase primarily due to people working from home, and then now in 2021 we're seeing the reverse of that as people are working from home less, but probably still some element of it there. I think one point we would have mentioned in the past, and Paul may dig into in more detail, is really that we have seen a bit of a stagnation of reductions in emissions in the residential sector, and we had seen decreases in per household emissions for many years, but up until around the mid 2010s. But since then, and since you can see from the graph there, since 2015 or 16, it has been fairly has plateaued more or less, and particularly on a per household level. So it is something that we are conscious that really the ramp up of measures in the climate action plan, such as heat pumps and energy retrofits, will be needed before we get to see those emissions come down again. Finally, as I say, it's not something we include in our total quoted emissions figure, but the land use change and forestry sector is part of what we submit to the UN, and the UN is also part of what's in the Climate Act targets and in the carbon budget. So it's worth having a bit of a discussion around these numbers as well. So as you can see, overall, the black line there is the net emissions from this sector. Below the line, you can see the removals from forestry and harvested wood products. And above the line, you're seeing everything else. And it may be a bit of a surprise to some people, the big red box, which is the bulk of the emissions, is coming from grassland. And that's because there are two types of grassland in a sense. There's agricultural grassland that's on mineral soils, and there's grassland that's on organic soils or former peat soils. So for drained bogland essentially turned to grassland, and that is a very strong source of emissions. Has a very high emission factor when you drain organic soils to grow grass. So what we're seeing is that even though there's only in the just 330,000 hectares or so of grassland on those organic soils, compared to over 3 million hectares on our mineral soils, the emissions from that smaller portion far outweigh the removals that are coming from the remaining grassland. So on balance, we see a big emission from the grassland source, and you can see the overall emissions there are nearly 8 million tonnes in 2021. Another thing just to point out, and you're beginning to see it at the end of the series there in 2021, the darker blue bar for forest land. We're starting to see already a big reduction in the amount of removals coming from that source, and that's because of the maturity of the forest stand at this point. So a lot of this forest was planted, and the big areas were planted in the early 1990s, and is reaching now maturity at the point where it's been harvested, and that tends to have a negative impact in terms of emissions over the period of harvesting. If we hadn't, if the level of planting hadn't kept pace on a constant level, and that hasn't been the case in recent years. We've had a big reduction in afforestation levels, so there's really nothing offsetting that. So it is something we've got in our projections and pointed it out in our projections launch, that we're anticipating this sector becoming a source of emissions as well in the near future. So some big challenges ahead there to really make the most of our land use and start to reduce emissions, and then maybe head towards removals in the future. Finally, then, I'll just touch on a little bit on the remaining sectors. And so we've got the manufacturing combustion sector increasing emissions by 0.9%, and that would be probably some element of the COVID rebound there as well. So we're beginning to see some activity, some businesses that may have been closed in 2020 or at a lower level, increasing again in 2021. The industrial processes sector emissions increased by 16.8%, and the bulk of what's in the industrial processes emissions are emissions associated with the production of cement. And we saw an increase in cement production in 2021, partly because, again, like with the manufacturing combustion, some cement companies were not operating at full capacity in 2020 or were closed for long periods. So that is. But compounded with that is the fact that we're seeing an uptick in construction activity as well. So it is a number of factors. But yes, the biggest driver on that is the increase in cement production. In terms of waste and F-gas emissions, we're seeing declines for both. As I pointed out at the start, that these are sectors where we're currently estimating, because we don't have the final inventory data for it at the moment. But we do expect this kind of trend to continue. From the waste sector, we've seen decreases over recent years as a result of the reduction in landfill, and most of the emissions in this sector come from landfill gas, whereas in the F-gas sector we're seeing reductions because we're seeing a move away from F-gases with higher global warming potentials. I mean, in the past you would have seen air conditioners in cars that would have had emissions that were equivalent to tons of CO2 in just the one unit, and that's something that's changed markedly over the years under the EU's F-gas regulation. So we see that even though there's more use of equipment like that, there's an increase in the amount of mobile air conditioners used in cars, for example, and heat pumps being used. But the F-gas they are using are lower in terms of their global warming potential. So that offsets the increased gas being used. In terms then of the commercial and public services sectors, again, these sectors do tend to align closely with what happens in the residential sector, because it's really heating buildings is the biggest source of emissions, and we have seen a 3% drop in commercial services, 3.8 in public services in 2021. Again, with the final energy balance, those numbers may get revised slightly, but we don't anticipate the overall energy use to be affected. And again, the warmer winter, if you like, would have played a role there, as well as potentially fuel prices towards the end of the year as well. So finally, then just to conclude, I think what we're seeing, and I've highlighted it, is a very significant increase in emissions in 2021. I mean, partly that would have been somewhat expected following the decrease in 2020 from the COVID restrictions, but what I'm saying here is that that only explains part of it. There are energy supply developments, and particularly this move to coal again, which is independent of COVID, although impacted by other international factors such as the gas prices. And then there's a continued link between production and emissions in some other sectors, including agriculture, which means that those factors are really responsible for a greater portion of the emissions than the actual rebound from COVID. In terms of the targets, then, as Sharon pointed out, it will require systemic and transformative change. And really, we said this when we launched the projections, but it's equally true here. The implementation of measures that are in the Climate Action Plan is needed as soon as possible, and it's something that we will bring into the inventory as soon as these measures have an impact. We'll look to bring them in here, and hopefully we'll have a better news story for you in the future. So that's it for me. I think I will direct you to our website, I think, for further information, but please hang on and listen to Paul, because Paul will give you the detail on a sectoral basis and really give you an insight into the drivers behind the emissions. I'll hand back to you then, Mary Frances. Thank you.